So after reading a bunch of the research on online learning, you may be feeling like, okay, this is interesting. So what? What do I make of this? Let's step away or take a step back and just talk about very high level what all of the research on online learning really means. So there have been three major meta-analyses of the research. And what a meta-analysis is a study design where we look at not just one study, but we look at all of the studies that have been conducted and use statistical procedures to equalize or normalize the findings across those studies. And there's a process for determining, what's a solid enough research to be included or not. But basically, a meta-analysis looks across all of the research that's been done to date. So for online learning, there have been 3 of these, which is a lot. What that also should be suggesting to you is that there are a lot of studies that have been done. And in fact, there are hundreds of studies that have been conducted on online learning. By now, we may be well up over 1,000 or so, in part because a lot of people, when they're new to online learning, they ask the same sort of question: how does this compare to face-to-face learning? So they set up a comparison study where they compare, say, a classroom-based version of the class to an online version of the class. And these are what we call media comparison studies, because they're comparing the medium through which the class is being offered. In this case, they're comparing the classroom to online. And it's sort of a default, very intuitive sort of question to ask. However, there have been, as I note, hundreds of these. And as we look at the patterns across those, we quickly learn a lot both about the nature of that sort of research, and we can walk away with some summaries of research. In fact, these are so well done, and we can predict the outcomes of these kinds of studies so well that we actually don't even let students here anyway conduct any more comparison studies because they're not considered a novel contribution to research at this point. So one of the most famous meta-analyses out there is the Department of Education meta-analysis that was done just a few years back. It looked at blended learning as well. This is probably the one that got shared the most frequently. The authors of one of your texts, Means and Bacchia, they were actually involved in that DOE meta-analysis as well. Some of the others, I'll include the references, have been around and been known. They've all found essentially the same thing. So what they found is that students perform as well as or better than students in face-to-face classrooms. Now, we have to dissect that and what that means, because that can be a really surprising finding to people. The shorthand for that is that it's not the technology that matters, but the design. In other words, what that means is that there's nothing special about a classroom or 4 walls, learning happening within 4 walls, that makes it somehow better than learning that happens online. Conversely, there's nothing magical about online that actually makes it better than classroom learning. You can have a poorly designed or ineffective learning environment in a classroom just as much as you can have a poor learning opportunity online. And conversely, you can have a great learning experience in a classroom just like you can have a great learning experience online. And so what we've learned is that it's not that technology or the medium of delivery that matters, but the design. And that's actually kind of cuts 2 ways. First of all, what we discovered in the research was that the reason that online tended to perform better than, in the instances where it was better than, what was going on there was that people were paying a lot more attention to design decisions in an online class or learning environment because it was new. They didn't quite know how to do it, so they were really slowing down and thinking much more methodically about, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to do that? So they're far more intentional. So the very presence of intentional design in and of itself tends to lead to a better learning experience and stronger learning outcomes. Now, hopefully at this point, you're thinking to yourself, well, that could apply to, my classroom instruction or blended or online. And you're absolutely right. That's actually a really important takeaway. The more that we stop and we are intentional and planful about how we put these things together, the better they tend to go. So in addition to that, there are design options. And there are some design features that are more effective than other design features. So the research in the field has shifted away from this question of whether or not online or face-to-face is better. We sort of settled that from a research perspective. We're like, look, we've studied this into the ground. We've got hundreds, if not more, studies. They keep telling us the same thing over and over. It's kind of time to move on from that research question and focus on what makes for an effective online learning environment. So we'll get into that. If we can keep the learning outcomes constant from face-to-face to online, then patterns that we tend to see more with folks applying online is that they may not be so focused on increasing learning outcomes as much as increasing access or flexibility or affording new or different options or opportunities while holding those learning outcomes constant or improving upon them in some way. So when we talk about like measuring the difference, or when I talk with folks about that are like district level or organizational level implementations of technology, learning outcomes are really important, but we're also looking at other sorts of organizational outcomes like increased access, increased flexibility, increased affordability, because we can rely on reliably consistent learning outcomes as long as a systematic design process is employed. And you should be learning that systematic design process both through lesson plan development as well as the instructional design process. The instructional design process isn't actually just a design process. That process was developed over many years and honed into a systematic process that reliably delivers learning outcomes. So that's a very reliable process. So in short, what research tells us is that by using a systematic process and informing that with research on learning and how people learn, and then pairing that with very clear objectives, both learning objectives as well as organizational objectives, right in that sweet spot between these three, that's where really effective learning and use of online learning occurs. And there's your 3 meta-analyses. So let's look at some of those key insights from research. I'm going to break this down in terms of myths. One myth that a lot of people tend to have is that students work in isolation. That can be true. We see this like in MOOCs or, some instantiations of online learning. I would say that most of those are online learning efforts that have been built by non-education entities, whether it's a startup company or an IT person or, something like that. But humans are social people. Bandura was really onto something. So in actuality, a lot of online courses are very social. They're collaborative in nature, or they've got interaction built in, and we'll look at interaction as part of the research as well. So those social and collaborative strategies are more common and they're more effective. So the more you design online learning to be social and collaborative, the better it is for everybody. There's higher satisfaction and the learning outcomes are stronger. Most people think it tends to be 100% asynchronous. I run into this all the time, as if you could draw an equal line between online equals asynchronous. That's not true. That's why we went through the whole history and the taxonomies and talking about that at first. And that's actually why I wanted you to start with that whole universe of ideas or universe of possibilities discussion, was so that you could learn it's not just a single planet in the solar system called asynchronous, but rather there are so many different ways to do this. It can be 100% asynchronous. That's usually what's best for adult learners, although I've got a caveat to that. For K-12, a blend is better. And I would even take that a step further and say required synchronous sessions really are better. For the younger the learner goes, the more synchronous becomes a really helpful tool in your toolkit. And I would even say that with like undergrads as well. So another myth is that online blended courses are less work. That myth tends to be focused more on the student experience, although it somehow gets interpolated into the instructor experience. In truth, and there's a lot of data to back this up, it is often more effort for the instructor. It's a lot of work behind the scenes to put together an online course. For the student, it should be designed to be equal effort for the student. Not less, not more. Sometimes they end up feeling like more because more kind of gets piled in. Sometimes they end up feeling like less because, especially if it's it hasn't been designed around types of interaction, then it can just be an online content dump, and students are just kind of going through, reading stuff, discussing, and they're not really doing or applying anything. Those are all bad designs that don't lead to any meaningful learning outcomes. If you want an online course that leads to meaningful outcomes and is a great experience, then it's going to be more work for the instructor in particular. So for you guys, as you learn how to teach online and put things together, just be aware. You're going to be doing a lot of work behind the scenes, planning, putting it together. Like we said, organization is big. There's a lot of effort that goes in there. And then you're spending a lot of your time interacting with the students and giving feedback too. Those are all very meaningful, but they take a lot of time. And then online courses are mainly a bunch of readings or videos. Again, they can be. Certainly, there are a lot of bad examples out there of online content dumps, but that's not effective. And I would say that that's actually not education. I would say, if we want to be very specific in our language, that anything online that is purely videos or readings is online content. That's not online education. Content selection and sequencing is certainly crucial. And then multimedia principles that you'll be learning later really should help you guide selection and creation of content when possible. But it doesn't stop at content. We have to move on into instructional strategies and interaction. Okay, all these design options and criteria, if the classroom doesn't make a difference versus online or vice versa, then what is it that makes a difference? And in Means, Bakke, and Murphy, you've been reading about some of those. They called them moderating variables because that's how we talk about it from a research perspective. But another way to think about these moderating variables is that these are actually design options. So here are kind of the big buckets of different design options. You have to make decisions about modality, about pacing, about the student to instructor ratio, about the type of pedagogy you're going to employ, about assessments, different types of assessments. You have to decide, what is the instructor's role going to be? What's the student's role going to be? Is it going to be synchronous, asynchronous, a mix of both? And then your feedback. So let me map out all of the ways that this breaks down. There we go. And now, of course, this starts to seem a little bit overwhelming. So I've actually provided this PowerPoint to you. One thing you could do is print out this page from your PowerPoint and go through and essentially circle the features on this page that are the features that you want in the learning environment that you want to put together. So are you talking about doing something that's fully online? Or I like how they break down blended, where, is this over 50% is online, or somewhere between a fourth and a half is online, or is it just really web-enabled face-to-face? Is it going to be self-paced? Is it class-paced? Or is it class-paced with some degree of self-paced to it? As you know, your online learning experience here at Curry is class-paced. And that was a very intentional decision on our part. We're not offering self-paced learning. And I will say, the data around self-paced is really mixed. It works okay for adult learners who say, I've always been interested in rhetorical analysis or how to cook Indian food, or I wanted to refresh myself on, some concept from physics or statistics or something. So you go out online, maybe you go to Khan Academy or something like that, read up on it, find a video on YouTube, that's okay. But the learner drives the objectives, the nature of that. I mean, there's absolutely nothing formal about self-paced learning. So no surprise, the learning results from that can be all over the board. There may be reasons why some initiative should be self-paced. But by and large, when we're talking about formal education or for-credit education, whether that's in higher ed or K-12, we're looking at class-paced instruction. That's also in part because we see, benefits from social interaction in the online space. So having a class-paced course also means you're going to have, or an opportunity for at least, interaction between the students in the class if you design and plan for that. Student to instructor ratios. This is another one where we really do see differences between these options. It says less than or equal to 35 because that's the way that the research breaks down. But most people agree that as soon as you start getting above 20 students in a class, it is really hard for an instructor to support that many students effectively. 20 to 25 is, an instructor is really starting to get stretched pretty thin at that point. Anything above 25 is really putting a tremendous burden on an instructor in an online class. So here at Curry, we've actually set a policy that online classes shouldn't be any larger than 25. I have done classes that are larger than that are online. They are rare exceptions, so I don't want to suggest that this is really hard and fast. But if you're going to go up above that 25 point, it has to be very carefully considered. You're going to need instructional supports. There are just all kinds of other things that come into play as soon as you go above that 25 threshold. And really each of these do represent new breaking points. There's a big difference between teaching 100 students versus like 50 students. So as soon as you're getting into that 100 to 1,000 range, that just requires a whole different approach, different strategies, different assessment strategies, things like that. For the MOOCs or things like that, the massive online courses that are above 1,000, that's a whole different beast. And I would tend to argue those really tend to devolve into content dumps. So the higher the student-instructor ratio goes here, the lower quality and satisfaction tends to go as well. Of course, pedagogies, expository would be your lecture. We want to try and avoid that. Practice and exploratory, that's a lot of like what this class is all about. We wanted you to actually be taking what you're learning and applying it, whether it's through your lesson planning or through your practicum, things like that. So it could be in a math class where you're wanting them to not just work out and solve problems, but, apply a particular approach or, a theory or something like that to a problem or a piece or whatnot. So it's, as you know, in your own face-to-face classrooms, more pedagogy or different methods or strategies, I should say, that really get the students interacting with and acting on that content, the active learning strategies. Those make a big difference in online learning just as well as they do face-to-face. Just like you do in a classroom, there may be some need for expository. This is a good example, this video you're listening to right now, where you probably have some expository or direct instruction that is integrated in with a lot more practice and discussion and collaboration. I'm going to move over here to the instructor roles and the student roles. The instructor can have a very active presence, which certainly represents my own philosophy, which I hope you feel that. The instructor can have a small presence online, and that could be for a variety of reasons as to why you would select that. That doesn't tend to be quite as effective because students, the less present an instructor is in a class, the more students really feel that sense of distance and remoteness in an online class. Where we see lower levels of instructor presence, we see higher dissatisfaction rates and higher feelings of isolation in the online class. So this instructor role and that active online presence really actually makes a big difference, both in the learning outcomes. Because if you think about it, if you're interacting with me or with your instructor, talking about the content, getting to ask questions, things like that, that helps you clarify your understandings. But that also helps you feel connected to another human being, which as human beings who are social, that helps us tend to it and recall things better, et cetera, all those benefits of social learning. Same thing with the student role online. If the student role is simply to listen or read, that's a very inactive or passive role, doesn't tend to lead to strong learning outcomes. Completing problems or answering questions, those are great, but they tend to be more associated with lower level or learning objectives on Bloom's taxonomy. That's not to be dismissive, because you have to address lower levels in Bloom's taxonomy. Like, students have to get basic ideas and concepts and language and things like that in place before they can go on and really do more sophisticated manipulation of that. So these are important and play a role. We just don't often want to stop there. So exploring simulations and resources, depends on your objectives for your class as to whether a simulation would really make sense. I've taught a class where we had a simulation. We had students from Germany that were part of that. In fact, I'm going to create a video to give you that as an example. But that fit that class and those objectives. Obviously, in this class, we don't actually have a simulation because you're out observing and doing the real thing. So maybe you're putting together resources or collaborating with peers or things like that. These are all things that help, anything that helps move students into evaluating, analyzing, all of that good stuff. It translates into a more active student role online. For online communication synchrony, this is one that's really more kind of options. There's not really good or bad here. It's not like synchronous is always better or asynchronous is always better. This really depends on your learners and the content. For example, I teach some really high-level classes that are 100% asynchronous. And we can do that, and I get high ratings on those classes. At the same time, there are other content areas where students really want a lot more synchronous interaction, even for adult learners at a graduate studies level. That may be something like stats or a really advanced stats class or something like that, whereas there may be other content areas where the learner is okay with that. Where I wanted to spend a little bit of time here is discussing this idea of some blend of both. When do you want to blend both, and how do you want to blend both? So let's dig a little bit deeper into this design option of synchronous learning. In K-12, Steph's 2 cents, or Dr. Moore's 2 cents, synchronous is strongly recommended. Especially the more difficult or complex a subject matter is, the more I think you're going to want to get your students in front of you in real time and see how well, and with what degree of facility are they able to work through content, answer questions, things like that. They may be able to do it fine if they've got all week to work on an answer. But if you get them in front of you and they're like, oh gosh, they're really not moving through it very quickly, that probably indicates they're actually not mastering the content. It also helps bump up accountability, of course. If students are going to know that they're going to have to show up in front of you in real time and answer this, they're going to spend more time, frankly, with the content. It helps to increase motivation and increase attention, and because they want to be able to answer those questions. You may be observing some environments where synchronous is optional, and then you're walking away thinking, gee, students don't show up for this. Synchronous isn't working. It's not the synchronous technology itself that's not working. It's the fact that it's probably optional. So if you're observing that in, an example you're out there observing, or in your practica or something like that, you may not have a locus of control right now to change that in the class that you're observing. But I want you to think about, what would you do differently? And this is one of those things where I really suggest you might want to consider doing this differently. Require your students to show up. Anticipate that students will have a lot of questions or want a lot of feedback and guidance, especially in K-12. And then again, there are learner populations that we know will struggle or have very wide variability in their learning and performance. Sometimes online and K-12 gets used for at-risk learners or, various learner populations. If you know you're going to be working with a learner population that struggles, or if you're going to be teaching a general class where you'll have very wide variability in learning and performance, i.e. not an honors class, you may want to very seriously consider requiring synchronous in addition to the asynchronous. Even for your gifted learners, use it as an opportunity to do some really creative activities, like run simulations or have breakout groups, have them generate stuff together in real time. Throw down challenges to them in real time and put time parameters around them. Your gifted students will love stepping up, and your not gifted students will love having a lot of structure and immediate support and immediate feedback as well. So some of the instructional value that synchronous affords is having the students do the work right in front of you, so you can see in real time how they solve problems or what they struggle with, and you can give immediate feedback. Get right in there, give them feedback, get them on their way. This also increases interaction, which is so crucial to online. They get to interact with each other, and they get to interact with you, especially if you design to facilitate that. So let's go back over here to our design options. So hopefully you can start to think through, what are all of these different options before you. In terms of feedback, you may want to automate some. You may have feedback come from the teacher, or you may have feedback come from your peers. For example, in our class, you get feedback from your instructor, and you also get feedback from your peers as you work. And that was a very intentional decision on our part. We wanted you to be able to share your work with each other, see what each other is doing, and even practice giving feedback and support to each other. But of course, we also wanted to be right in there ourselves, giving you support and feedback as well. In terms of online assessments, frankly, here at UVA, we tend to use the online assessment mechanisms to input grade. It is about that basic. We don't have any data analytics in our system, but there are an increasing number of systems that do have data analytics to help you determine if students are ready for new content, or tell the system how to support a student with adaptive instruction. This is very expensive, by the way, so you may not see this. We see this like in Army, DoD type applications where they've got a large budget. Provide student or teacher with information about the learning state. There's kind of a little bit, we could interpret a little bit of that to be occurring in CoLab. Inputting grades, and then identifying students at risk of failure. The online system itself doesn't actually help us do that, here at Curry, but there are increasingly LMSs or tools that you can add into an LMS that help with that, especially in K-12 environments. So, but this is something more for like a ITRT or a director, coordinator of technologies, that kind of person, to be thinking about, do we want these features at the system level so that it can help and inform the instruction? All of the rest of these are really classroom or instruction level decisions, not program level decisions. Program level decisions and features are a whole separate ball of wax. Okay, so I also gave you references, if anybody wants to run out there and read a bunch of these. You're reading some of these in your class, so you've had some of these where we're reading through them here. Or you may actually have access to some of these in a different class. But anyway, there's your literature base for this. We'll look at 3 big ideas from research in detail in the next video. Thank you so much.